It ended not with a victory parade, but with silence. The kind of silence that hangs thick over shattered cities and grieving homes, a quiet too heavy to celebrate. After 3 decades of struggle, from French colonization to American intervention, Vietnam stood bloodied, but reunified. Yet in that moment of supposed resolution, the real question emerged. What does peace mean to a country destroyed by war? Is it the return of sovereignty? Or the beginning of an even deeper wound, one that lives in memory, not battlefields? This is the story the world rarely sees. Not the war, but the scars it left behind. In the spring of 1975, the final rotor blades of American Hueys faded into the sky over Saigon. The war was over, at least on paper. In reality, it had merely shifted forms. Instead of firefights and carpet bombs, now came re-education, exile, famine, and a deep national trauma. Over 3 million people had died across the wars that plagued Vietnam since the 1940s. Most were civilians, farmers, villagers, young conscripts, their homes burned by both sides, their futures shattered by ideology. The gender balance of the nation was so disrupted that census data decades later still showed a marriage squeeze, a haunting demographic echo of male death in war. By 1989, even as Vietnam stabilized, the country's social structure had yet to recover. And then came the chemicals. The United States, desperate to deny the North Vietnamese cover in the jungle, had unleashed something far more insidious than bullets. Agent Orange, Agent White, Agent Blue. More than 10% of Vietnam's land was defoliated with toxins. The forests never grew back properly, and neither did the people. Birth defects became tragically common. Cancers, miscarriages, and poisoned water systems rippled across generations. The war had ended, but the damage kept spreading. In the South, the communist government began reasserting total control. Re-education camps sprang up, but these were no classrooms. Southern officers, intellectuals, and even mid-level civil servants were rounded up, made to labor under starvation and disease, often with no charges filed. Between 750,000 and 1 million South Vietnamese were forcibly relocated, their property seized, their names blacklisted, their past erased. And yet, some escaped. Women who had married American soldiers called war brides managed to emigrate before the window closed. So did some children born to those unions, though many were simply abandoned as the Americans withdrew. Author Gabriel Garcia Marquez would later call the cost of Vietnam's war a grim arithmetic. 360,000 mutilated, 1 million widows, 500,000 prostitutes, 500,000 drug addicts, 1 million soldiers of the old regime stripped of role, purpose, or path forward. This wasn't reconstruction. This was a country in psychological freefall. Just 3 years after the flag of unification flew over Saigon, Vietnam was once again at war. This time, not with a foreign invader, but with a fellow communist neighbor. The Khmer Rouge had seized control of Cambodia under Pol Pot, a man who idolized Mao Zedong's radicalism and pushed it to its most brutal extreme. Within 3 years, Cambodia descended into madness. Torture, starvation, mass executions in the killing fields. 1 in every 4 Cambodians would die. Vietnam, both alarmed by cross-border raids and politically wary of a hostile regime on its doorstep, decided to intervene. In late 1978, Vietnamese troops crossed the border and crushed the Khmer Rouge within weeks. But toppling Pol Pot was only the beginning. The Vietnamese quickly found themselves caught in a familiar nightmare. As one veteran put it bitterly, American soldiers thought they helped Vietnam. Then their illusion was broken. We were the same in Cambodia, only worse. Indeed, Vietnam had become the very thing it once resisted, an occupying force in a foreign land. The irony was crushing, and China noticed. Pol Pot had been China's ally. Vietnam, on the other hand, had leaned increasingly toward the Soviet Union. To Beijing, this was not just a betrayal. It was an opportunity. In February 1979, China launched a full-scale invasion into northern Vietnam, calling it a punitive campaign. Though brief, the conflict was brutal. Tens of thousands were killed in just under a month. Chinese forces were ill-prepared for Vietnam's rugged terrain and ferocious defense, and they soon withdrew. But not before sending a deadly message. No neighbor would be allowed to dominate Indochina unchecked. The Chinese incursion also triggered a wave of ethnic violence. Vietnamese citizens of Chinese descent, over 450,000 of them, were driven from their homes. Not by Chinese soldiers, but by their own Vietnamese neighbors. Ethnic tension, ideological division, foreign invasion. Vietnam's post-war era was turning into a second, slower-burning conflict, one of identity, paranoia, and survival. But even that was only one layer of the crisis. The war had left Vietnam economically broken. Its cities were crumbling, its farmlands contaminated, its trade networks cut off. The country faced famine in the early 80s. State-run factories failed to meet even basic needs. Price controls and centralized planning only deepened the misery. So, in 1986, the Communist Party did something few expected. It admitted failure and changed course. The program was called Doi Moi, renovation. Vietnam would remain politically communist, but economically, it began to open its doors. Central planning was rolled back. Price controls eliminated. State-run monopolies dismantled. 15% of public sector jobs were cut. Vietnam, once closed to the world, now welcomed foreign investment. And the results were staggering. In 1990, nearly 60% of Vietnamese lived in poverty. By 2006, that number had dropped to 16%. The streets of Ho Chi Minh City began to bustle. Factories rose along the Mekong. Children carried plastic school bags through neighborhoods once scorched by napalm. But progress came with a price. What does it mean for a communist state to embrace capitalism? And what happens when ideology is quietly traded for pragmatism? As Vietnam turned inward to heal, the world turned a wary eye outward. The Cold War was thawing. The Soviet Union, Vietnam's main patron, was beginning to crack. And with Moscow's decline came a diplomatic reckoning in Hanoi. Vietnam could no longer afford isolation. It needed new partners, even old enemies. In 1995, 20 years after the fall of Saigon, Vietnam and the United States normalized diplomatic relations. Ambassadors were exchanged. Trade missions opened. And veterans of both sides, once sworn enemies, now stood quietly before memorial walls, not in anger, but in grief. But this reconciliation was not born of sentiment. It was strategy. Vietnam had begun to see the looming shadow of China. Although Hanoi and Beijing shared a common ideology, they did not share common trust. The invasion of Cambodia, the war in '79, the historical enmity between the two cultures, all simmered beneath the surface. Beijing's growing assertiveness in the South China Sea only heightened Hanoi's anxiety. So Vietnam turned westward, reaching out not just to America, but to Australia, Japan, and Europe. And yet, it was never a clean break. Hanoi refused to become anyone's pawn again. So it played a delicate game, what some analysts now call bamboo diplomacy. Flexible, resilient, rooted, able to bend without breaking. But even as Vietnam opened its doors to the world, it could not forget the trauma it carried within. While Vietnam wrestled with rebuilding, the United States struggled with remembering. The Vietnam War had become more than a military defeat. It was a psychic wound. The term Vietnam Syndrome emerged, a label for America's hesitation to engage in future conflicts. A fear of repeating the same mistakes. A guilt that no victory parade could wash away. Presidents from Nixon to Reagan blamed the media, the protesters, the politicians who tied the military's hands. Some, like Secretary of State Alexander Haig, insisted the war could have been won if only America had unleashed its full power. But others saw the truth more clearly. Vietnam was not lost on the battlefield. It was lost in the minds and hearts of both Americans and Vietnamese, lost in the gap between what was promised and what was delivered. The draft, one of the most hated aspects of the war, was abolished in 1973. And the United States has remained an all-volunteer military ever since. But the echoes of that conscription system, the protests, the deferments, the burning of draft cards, still haunt American political culture. Trust in government had eroded, and with it, faith in intervention. Beyond the battlefield and ballot box, Vietnam left another wound: economic collapse. President Lyndon B. Johnson, in his ambition to fight both poverty at home and communism abroad, refused to raise taxes to fund the war. Instead, spending soared unchecked. Inflation spiked. Industrial capacity was stretched to World War II levels, and public trust in fiscal management began to crumble. By the time the war ended, the Vietnam conflict had cost the United States over $977 billion in adjusted modern terms. But the cost wasn't just monetary. It was spiritual. A nation that once believed itself invincible had been brought low not by a great power, but by a determined, divided people in a faraway land. And that land, Vietnam, now faced its own paradox. Peace had come, but so had new battles, internal, invisible, and ongoing. What happens when a war ends? But the silence that follows becomes its own kind of violence. In post-war Vietnam, the most painful battles were not always fought with guns, but with memory. An entire generation grew up with ghost stories, only these were real. Fathers never came home. Uncles whispered of jungle trails, of friends who vanished in the night. Villages still held ceremonies for the missing, no bodies, no graves, just names etched into fading stone. There were children born under American bombardment who would never know what normal childhood meant. And there were others, born to Vietnamese mothers and American fathers, the Amerasians, whose very existence became a burden, neither truly Vietnamese nor truly American. Many were left behind after the withdrawal, abandoned, isolated, stigmatized. It would take years before the United States allowed a fraction of them to immigrate. The pain was compounded by silence. In Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City, the state wrote a single version of history: heroes, martyrs, victories. But where was the space for grief? For confusion? For the farmers whose fields were cratered? For the children whose schools were turned into barracks? The government had little room for dissent. Re-education was not just for people, it was for memory. The cultural landscape of Vietnam also bore the marks of rupture. The South, once cosmopolitan, westernized, and commercially vibrant, was forced to adopt the austere, collectivist norms of the North. Saigon became Ho Chi Minh City. French villas were nationalized. Private businesses closed or fled. But culture is a stubborn thing. Even as the government tried to enforce unity, regional differences endured. Southern dialects, cuisine, and values never vanished. They went underground. They adapted. A generation of artists, musicians, and writers emerged in exile in California, in Paris, in Sydney, preserving the voices the homeland tried to forget. And back in Vietnam, as censorship slowly loosened, a new genre began to appear: the war from within. Books, films, and memoirs quietly explored not just the battlefield, but the emotional wreckage left in its wake. Even former soldiers began to speak, not with triumph, but with tremors. One North Vietnamese veteran wrote, "We won the war, but I lost my soul. I killed men who never knew my name." In the United States, too, the reckoning was far from complete. Unlike previous wars, returning soldiers from Vietnam were not greeted with fanfare but suspicion. They became symbols of a national failure. Or worse, walking reminders of atrocities. Hollywood at first ignored them. Then, it began to mythologize them as broken men, traumatized killers, or vigilantes lost in the American landscape. But real veterans had no scripts, just nightmares. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, was only beginning to be understood. Hospitals were underfunded. Therapy was stigmatized. Some turned to drugs, some to silence, some to the barrel of a gun. America had trained them for war, but it had not prepared them for peace. And in politics, The war became a litmus test. Every candidate for decades was measured against Vietnam. What they did, what they said, how they voted. Even future conflicts from Iraq to Afghanistan were debated through the lens of another Vietnam. No one wanted to step into that jungle again. Yet somehow, they always did. The war may have ended above ground, but beneath the soil, it kept breathing. Across Vietnam's countryside, a silent killer continued its march. Not landmines, though those too were plentiful, but dioxin. Agent Orange, the infamous defoliant sprayed by the United States over millions of acres, had soaked not only the forests, but the bloodlines. Entire villages reported clusters of rare cancers. Children were born with twisted limbs, missing eyes, or no limbs at all. The food chain itself was compromised. Fish, rice, even breast milk carried the poison. The Vietnamese Red Cross estimates that over 4 million people were affected. Generations had been chemically altered without their consent. And yet, the United States government remained largely silent for decades. Veterans who handled the defoliants began reporting similar illnesses. Only then, under mounting legal pressure, did official recognition begin. Today, dioxin hotspots are still being cleaned. International partnerships, including American-led projects, have tried to contain the damage. But can you ever unburn a forest? Can you ever remove a toxin from memory? As Vietnam tried to rebuild, its people scattered. In the years following the fall of Saigon, more than 1 million Vietnamese fled the country by boat, often at the mercy of pirates, storms, and starvation. They became the boat people refugees, adrift in Southeast Asia, hoping for resettlement. Some found new homes in the United States, Canada, France, and Australia. They built thriving communities, Little Saigon in California, Vietnamese enclaves in Paris, Melbourne, and Houston. But exile is never a clean cut. For many, the heart remained in Vietnam. Memories were frozen in time in the year 1975, in the last street they walked, the last flag they saw. And for those who returned decades later to visit or invest, they encountered a country that had moved on, but not forgotten. Their accents marked them as outsiders. Their dollars made them welcome. Their pasts made them complicated. And yet, through remittances, businesses, and dual citizenships, the diaspora became an invisible artery connecting Vietnam to the world. As Vietnam tried to rebuild, its people scattered. In the years following the fall of Saigon, more than 1 million Vietnamese fled the country by boat, often at the mercy of pirates, storms, and starvation. They became the boat people refugees adrift in Southeast Asia, hoping for resettlement. Some found new homes in the United States, Canada, France, and Australia. They built thriving communities, Little Saigon in California, Vietnamese enclaves in Paris, Melbourne, and Houston. But exile is never a clean cut. For many, the heart remained in Vietnam. Memories were frozen in time in the year 1975, in the last street they walked, the last flag they saw. And for those who returned decades later to visit or invest, they encountered a country that had moved on, but not forgotten. Their accents marked them as outsiders. Their dollars made them welcome. Their pasts made them complicated. And yet, through remittances, businesses, and dual citizenships, the diaspora became an invisible artery connecting Vietnam to the world. By the early 2000s, Vietnam had become something else entirely. A strategic fulcrum, caught between two giants, the People's Republic of China and the United States. Vietnam's geography made it both valuable and vulnerable. Beijing, asserting historical claims in the South China Sea, clashed directly with Hanoi's maritime interests. Vietnamese fishermen were harassed. Islands were militarized. Old tensions rose from the deep. Yet at the same time, China remained Vietnam's largest trading partner. Factories relied on Chinese parts. Markets flowed with Chinese goods. How does a country confront a threat when it's also your lifeline? That question drove Hanoi's embrace of multipolarity. Vietnam joined ASEAN, improved relations with Japan, India, Australia, and crucially, the United States. By 2013, U.S. Navy ships were visiting Vietnamese ports. By 2023, a comprehensive strategic partnership was signed between the two nations. And yet, neither side forgot the past. American policymakers approached Vietnam with both hope and historical weight. Vietnamese leaders opened their doors, but kept their guard. It was a new game of empire and influence. But Vietnam, this time, was determined not to be the battlefield, but the balancer. Today, Vietnam lives a double life. It is a nation rising fast, its cities buzz with motorbikes, neon signs, and ambitious youth. Yet just outside the cities, rice paddies still ripple with age-old labor, and old veterans sit quietly beneath war memorials, staring into distances only they can see. Ho Chi Minh City, once Saigon, is now a hub of tech startups and high-end malls. But if you ask the elders, they still call it Saigon. History does not yield so easily. Vietnam is proudly communist, yet fiercely entrepreneurial. It holds annual parades of red flags, even as its economy depends on foreign capital and global trade. Its press remains tightly controlled, its elections non-competitive yet online. A new generation expresses itself with coded sarcasm and veiled critiques. This duality is not confusion, it is strategy. Vietnam learned the hard way what it means to trust too deeply, to ally too quickly, to fight someone else's war. Now, it walks carefully between power and principle, memory and ambition. The post-war generation, born long after the last bomb fell, now lead the country. But their inheritance is complex. They carry not only the future, but the burdens of a past never properly buried. In Vietnamese classrooms, the war is remembered but selectively. Textbooks emphasize resistance, resilience, the heroic struggle against foreign aggressors. They celebrate Ho Chi Minh, General Giap, and the revolution. But the pain of the South? The purges? The re-education camps? The Amerindian children? The boat people? These are seldom mentioned. Officially, the war ended with glory. Unofficially, families still whisper about what was lost. In the South, private schools and Catholic institutions have found ways to teach alternative narratives, but the line between memory and censorship remains thin. Some students grow up with only half the story. Others inherit silence. And in the absence of open reckoning, the internet has become the new classroom where Vietnamese youth read, banned memoirs, watched foreign documentaries, and pieced together what really happened. The legacy in America, politics, culture, and echoes. Across the Pacific, Vietnam still casts a long shadow over American life. Every presidential campaign since the 70s has faced the same question. Who served? Who protested? Who learned? Vietnam is invoked when American troops are bogged down in the Middle East, when public support falters, when strategy seems rudderless. It is a cautionary tale, sometimes weaponized, sometimes misunderstood. In popular culture, Vietnam transformed from an open wound to a genre. Movies like Platoon, Apocalypse Now, and Full Metal Jacket reshaped public perception. They didn't explain the war, they reflected the trauma. Meanwhile, veterans slowly found their voice. Memorials were built. Marches were held. But the question remains, was healing ever complete? For many, the answer is no. For some, it cannot be. The sound of helicopters. Even now, a certain sound, the rhythmic chop of a helicopter, can silence a conversation. To the Vietnamese, it means the skies of war. To American veterans, it brings back the jungle, a soundtrack of conflict. That sound echoes through memories, through history, through politics. But more than that, it echoes through time, because no war ever truly ends. Not in the minds of those who fought it, not in the families who survived it, not in the nations still shaped by it.